let me ask you a first one, and then we have some questions coming in from our audience. Since we're a journalism organization, we're trying to help give good guidance to journalists and how they do their job. How, in your opinion, how well are the media covering poverty and inequality? What are they doing right, and what are they doing wrong in their coverage of those issues?
Push that to me. I just took a seat. Can you hear me well still?
Yes, we can.
Well, first of all, think about it. We've had, let's just go back to 2016. I won't go any further. We had 30-some presidential debates in primary and general election. I don't remember one specific question or period of time on how those candidates would address poverty. Even though we're talking about 43% of the nation, 66 million white people. That cannot continue to happen. Media cannot continue to allow candidates to skirt this issue and not deal with it. And whether it's, we can't let candidates get away with things like, if you just let me cut taxes, it's going to address the issue of poverty. Or people are poor because of their own personal refusal to do any better. Or let's just fix the middle class. Our campaign has actually been critical of both sides of the political aisle. And what we're saying to media is that we can't continue to have political conversations and discourse and not put a face on the issue of poverty and not force it into the political conversation. Now, we had 3 million people come online for the poor people, for the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Mass Moral March in Washington. We had fairly good coverage, but just be honest with it, not 3 million people, 3 million plus. And I don't know if any one of the stories were not of me, not of William Barber, but of the people you just saw was made front page in the time of COVID. When in fact, we know that especially in this time of COVID, poor and low wealth people are the ones being hurt the most because they were already being hurt and they were already dying. So I think we have to, that's why I'm so honored by what you're doing today. Now we're beginning to see more. I will say that we've begun to see more pushing of poverty and these issues into the public square. People are beginning to get more interested in what we're talking about. The Poor People's Campaign, there were some big articles when the special rapporteur at the UN did a crisscross across the country about poverty, but it's gotta be deeper. It has to be more prominent and it has to be more consistent because the issue of poverty and the interlocking injustices, and that's the thing, we have to make the connections. The interlocking injustices are hurting and breaking apart the heart of the democracy. And then lastly, we have to make sure we say poverty and low income, because the image too often has been embedded in people's minds. Poverty would mean somebody just homeless on the street, which is bad enough and terrible. Or poverty, it just means minority and Black on the margin. And we have to break that. And the media has to be a part of breaking that and has to help us force this into the center place of our American political discussions.
Okay, so let me ask one other question about journalism techniques. You're both adept in talking about studies and facts and figures, as well as sharing anecdotes and people's stories. And journalists do our work through those numbers and through people's stories. What do you think is more effective in getting people to pay attention to an issue they have not paid attention to, previously?
Well, I think right now is to tell the stories and let the stories tell the facts. I think it has to be an integration because again, ever since 1968, we've done everything we can. Remember, the first Poor People's Campaign was assassinated, killed, and murdered. It didn't just stop with Dr. King. And then the war on poverty was undermined by Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, what's his name? He was, they actually, when they came into office with Nixon, dismantled so much stuff. And it kind of drove it off of the political conversation. You think about it, I talked about 2016, but you could go back the last 20 years and ask, when have we ever had, just in the presidential elections, any real conversation around poverty? Now, people are quick to put up the face of middle class people, right? Or put up their face. And we're not anti that because a lot of people are middle class, but they're just on that corner of falling into poverty and low income. So I think it's the integration of stories like but it must be counterintuitive stories, right? So you take that farmer that you just saw, who are testifying right alongside Pamela Rush. So you got a Black woman from Alabama who's talking about poverty with her tears, and a white woman farmer from Kansas talking about poverty with her tears. That story needs to be lifted up because it breaks all of these preconceived notions about what poverty and low wealth really is. And then you use that to drive the numbers. But you can't just drive the numbers about poverty. You also have to drive the numbers about the solutions. And that what our studies have showed is the solutions are actually economically prosperous. In other words, it's a lie when we say, number one, we don't have the money, or number two, all we got to do, we just got to raise taxes and it's going to break this and break that. In fact, if we saw this as a human investment, as an economic investment, we're actually talking about benefiting the whole society as opposed to undermining. And we have, because there's a lie that's been out there, particularly in the South. And that is the lie that many white people, poor white people were told, is because other folk are getting these things, you are poor. And we have to undermine that and destroy that because it was done by design. Lee Atwater said he was going to do it by design as a part of the Southern strategy. And it would be used. It didn't just start with Trump. It's been used for a long. Trump just took it to the nth degree, but it's been out here for a long time, and it's potent and powerful, and it has to be unpacked.
Okay, so let's take some questions. I have a couple of questions that ask about the 5 interlocking factors of inequality. Could you just list off those 5 factors again?
Systemic racism, and let me just give a little brief commentary. When I say systemic racism, we're not talking about name calling and those things. We're talking about the systems. In fact, it's almost wrong to say systemic racism. We have to say that for clarity, but really you could just say racism. It's redundant to say systemic racism. Racism is it's not about name calling and who likes who. But underneath systemic racism, we talk about voter suppression, mass incarceration, desegregation of public schools, police violence and militarism, continual denial of justice to our immigrant brothers and sisters, particularly our Latino brothers and sisters, and then indigenous people, what the continuing mistreatment and injustice toward them. All of that's racism. It's not just Black, it's all of that's part of what we mean systemic racism. Then you have to connect that to systemic poverty and disaggregate all of what the numbers of poverty are part of that 140 million poor and low wealth people. Then we say ecological devastation and denial of health care. That has to do with the water, the air, and the land, and how it impacts communities all across this country. And then we say the war economy, which is a way of saying what Eisenhower said. When Eisenhower said that this nation better be careful of their military industrial complex. And he was a general. He believed in defending the country, but Eisenhower said, in fact, he called it the congressional military industrial complex, and they made him take congressional out, and he just called it, but he said that as a general. So if a general said it, surely we need to be really mindful of how this war economy, Dr. King once said it, whenever a military spending determines, let me paraphrase, determines everything about a society, that society is headed towards spiritual death. And then the last part of it is the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. And I don't have time fully to unpack that, Brother Adams, but this distorted moral religious nationalism and white evangelicalism connects all the way back to when corporate leaders wanted to undermine Social Security. And they paid people to go out and change the theology in the church. That's been documented. There's a book called One Nation Under God by a professor out of Princeton that lays this out both in theology and in monetary terms. I think every journalist ought to get it, because then you would understand a little bit deeper what's going on. It's not just people praying. And then that traces all the way back to slaveholder religion, where the slaveholders had to have a religion that okayed their plantation economic. So systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism are 5 interlocking injustices.
Okay, thanks. What was that book again that you just said we all ought to read?
under God, The Purchasing of the American Pulpit is one book. And then there's one by Jonathan Hartgrove called Being Set Free from Slave Master Religion. Because too often, and this is one thing I would say to the media, you know, a lot of times when we talk about religious figures, like if the issue of homosexuality were to come up, or the issue of abortion, we'll put like a Franklin Graham juxtaposed to minister. But we need to be deeper than that. We need to have some clerical people talking about economics and have a Franklin Graham juxtapose somebody like myself or somebody like Reverend Liz D. O'Hara, because at the end of the day, the push about against a woman's right to choose is the cover up for the larger agenda. And the larger agenda is that most of these folk are connected to heavy money that really is about upholding corporate goals and corporate dreams. And if you unpack it, you can see it. You can see it just as clear as day.
Okay. So as I said before, you can ask a question by audio, raise your hand, and we will call on some of you and turn the microphone over to you. The first one of those questions, audio question from Renee On Q, who is from the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. Renee, the microphone is yours.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, how can journalists use their platforms to not only highlight issues of poverty and inequality, but also make a change? And how do we make sure that we don't lean towards the sign of sensationalism when we're telling other people's stories?
Yeah, that's a very powerful question. And what we do when we go into communities, we get permission to go into the community. And what I found is that a lot of folk want to tell their story. They're tired of being ignored. They're tired of what we call attention violence. You know, the people up in the mountains of Kentucky are tired of being, and when I've gone up there, they're tired. They want to tell their stories. Ms. Rush, she invited us in. She said, and if telling my story can help change policy, I wanted to have her, because she basically, for instance, was manipulated into a predatory loan that ended up making her pay $114,000 on a basic sink double wide trailer. Can you imagine that? And all the other things that she faced in that particular community. So I think that there's a large number of people who don't see the telling of their story as sensational. They see the telling of their stories as necessary. And they're tired of being just not paid attention to politically or in the media otherwise. The other thing is journalists, I think, have to, I'm glad you all are having this, connect these issues, sit down with persons who can help connect them, do the empirical data, and also report on these movements. Like, for instance, I wish right now people were talking about the communities all over this country that are on rent strikes. You say, we're not, you know, they're saying, no, you're not going to just throw us out. The communities that are saying you're not going to evict us, homeless communities. You know, the effort, when we talk about, when sometimes Trump says, well, under my administration, income went up. It didn't go up because of him. It went up because of the fight for 15. And the people that have been fighting for years and have won significant victories in certain communities that have caused cities, New York, Seattle, other places, to raise their wages. And so it's important how you can help make change is by telling the story of the movements from the ground up, not just the movement leaders, but the movements that are going on from this ground up. Give me a case in point. We talk about over the last few weeks, is where we say there's been more movement with Black Lives Matter ever in the history of the country. That is true, but you also have to drill down into why. Happened during a pandemic, what happened on camera, but also, as I said in my talk, I Can't Breathe is a shorthand for how so many people are feeling. And then there's so much pain and so much death. And I think what you had is a collision of those things. It's not that George Floyd's death created it all. It was a spark, just like Emmett Till's death was a spark. But what did it spark? It sparked Rosa Parks sitting down to change the system. And then you have to connect that you're seeing diverse activism with BLM, but you also saw diverse activism with Sunrise Movement and with the Women's March and with the Me Too movement and with the Poor People's Campaign. So it's really not an issue of competing. It's more an issue of all of this energy colliding. And helping to tell that story helps us to see it in a different way. One of the things that we've made a mistake on, for instance, on the March on Washington, not the recent one, but the original one, is that when people retell that story, we say it was the I Have a Dream speech. Well, actually it wasn't. The speech was normalcy, never again. That was the speech. And it wasn't just Dr. King. And people didn't come there just to hear Dr. King. He came there because there were 600 cities where activism was going on across the country. And so part of, I think, how you media help change things is by telling that story of all of the activism. Lastly, I wish media companies would say to candidates that are running, we're going to do a presidential forum, but you're going to have to take questions from people who are dying from not having health care. You're going to have to take questions from people who are up in Appalachia suffering from poverty. In other words, make them have to take the whole forum, the whole thing, guided by journalists, but the whole thing be from people who are impacted, so that they can't do the two-step dance around it. They have to actually say what they're going to do if they get elected.
All right, thank you. So next question, audio question from Jill Sheridan at WFYI in Indianapolis. Jill, we're getting you unmuted.
Hey.
The microphone is yours.
Hi. Hi, Doctor. What advice might you have for reporters who are talking about the policies of poverty that relate to the disparity of violence that a lot of metropolitans are seeing right now? When you're talking about, death measures, certainly that's something that is influencing cities right now, and the roots of how poverty plays into that. It's obviously a touchy subject. What advice might you have?
Well, I think you have to do something that Dr. Coretta Scott King did in your reporting, and I'll tell you about that. Before I do that, Jill, let me say hello to a homegirl. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, August 1st, 1963, 2 days after the March on Washington. Coretta Scott King did a piece I think all of you all are reading. She was asked a question about violence. And see, what I'm saying is, if America's ready to talk about violence, let's talk about it. Let's deal with it. Have a grown-up conversation. You want to talk about death? Let's talk about death in all of its forms, not just in one form. And she said in her statement, she said, somebody asked Coretta, how do you feel about violence since your husband was shot and assassinated? She, in essence, said that's a form of violence. But violence is also denying a person health care and education and living wages and labor rights and denying them their culture. She said those are forms of violence. And then she said, and another form of violence is an apathetic attitude that refuses to address these forms of violence. So one of the things we have to be able to do is talk about violence in that way. And that's what you're saying. If you deal with the community where you have large amounts of, let's say, death in communities, you don't walk away from that. Our campaign is against killing, period, whether it's a racist cop that does it, or whether it's somebody in the community that kills one of our babies. We don't make an excuse for that. But just like you have to examine the culture of policing to get at that racist cop, you also must deal with what is the culture in that community. What's been the negligence? What has been the kind of violent public policy denial in those communities? And that's important to lift up, and it needs to be lifted up, right? Why is it that more guns are in that community than jobs? Why is it that there's more crime in that community than there are corporate investments in that community? Or why is the investment in the schools less than the investment in prisons? We have to address all of that. And I think we can. That's the point. I don't think it's either or. It's actually both and. But we need to have some real conversation about policy violence and attention violence. Let me give you an example. I have buried far too many kids from death. I've led, a drug dealer gangbanger redemption conference at my church, where we actually asked the judge to let us have drug dealers, gangbangers that are on the entry level for 3 or 4 days. We quarantine the church. We bring in people who've been formerly in the gangs and in that world. And we've been able to help bring some folk out, change their lives. But at the same time, I've had to bury people who died from the lack of health care that should not have been. And that's violent. And some of us, pastors, since COVID, have made a commitment that if anybody in our church died, you know, from the lack of health care and unnecessarily, we're going to ask the family, can we have an open casket funeral, just like Emmett Till's mama had an open casket funeral, and invite the media in and say, this is what public policy violence looks like. I think we're at that point in this country, because when you think about the millions, we're not talking about a few thousand people dealing with poverty and low wealth, we're talking about millions of people. And the thing that grabs me every day that I get up is that Columbia study that's actually old, but it's not that old. 700 people dying a day from poverty and low wealth. And then COVID hits and we got another 1,000 on top of that. And so I think to your question, we have to connect the two. The violence that comes from you can't just say people over here just killing and shooting people because they are somehow just immoral and there's no good. In fact, that's actually not telling the truth about America. Here's something we also have to say about America. America is a violent culture. Dr. King said it. John Lewis said it. That we are a violent culture. Far too many guns, far too many drugs, far too much out here that creates violence. And violence just doesn't happen in the poor community. Violence is all over this country, but that is not a skate around it. I'm not trying to skate around it. I'm saying we need to have a serious conversation about policy violence and all the forms of violence. That's why lastly, we've started saying that every negative public policy has a death measure on it. Every denial has a death measure. And so when we go in and talk to politicians, we don't say, are you on the left or the right? But do you want to deal with death? Do you want to deal with the first principle of our founding document, life, liberty, life? And if we're going to have a conversation about death, then let's have a serious conversation about death. And let's fix the policies that are causing the death.
Okay, so that gives us a nice segue to a question from Lois Collins of the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. Is Congress currently considering measures you believe would be especially helpful to families in poverty?
Not in full. We actually, when we presented our budget, we know that if Congress had taken up our budget last year, we wouldn't have some of the problems we're having right now in the midst of COVID. Because before COVID, people would have had sick leave and unemployment and living wages. We put all of that before Congress last year. And as I said, the first three bills we passed, CARES bill, while they did some good, I'm not knocking them. You know, what was finally passed, 83% of the money went to corporations and banks. Democrats did some good things, but there's some things they didn't do, because the first bill that came out of the House said that any company that had over 500 employees didn't have to guarantee sick leave. McConnell has constantly said that he's more interested in putting money toward the wealthy and toward the corporations than he is lifting up community. He's actually said that people are making money off of $600 unemployment, and that's why they're not going back to work, which is just asinine and backwards. So there is a bill now called the HEROES Act, and it has some good things in it. It doesn't have all that we think ought to be in it, because again, it doesn't guarantee living wages. It doesn't guarantee sick leave, unemployment. But it does provide some stimulus. It provides some more unemployment. It provides money for municipalities. And it should have been passed. It's not even all that we want, but it should have been passed when it was pushed over by the House, $3 trillion. Now there's negotiation to cut it, which we already know $3 trillion is not enough. We're doing a study now with the Economic Policy Institute that's going to analyze what's going to happen if we don't face this fully, and if we don't stop piecemealing. We're headed toward not a Great Depression, but a great destruction. When you think about the amount of death, you think about 40% of all the jobs under $40,000 being gone. You think about 30, 40 million people on the brink of eviction. We've not seen anything like that in this country in modern history. So the bill is a good bill. It's not the bill. It should be passed in Congress right now. But McConnell said, I'm not passing it. Why? And this is where he needs to, and let me just say this. When we deal with these issues of poverty, we also have to not just deal with the president, whoever the president is, because it's the Congress, it's the legislature. I'll give you one quick example. We call President Trump a racist, but McConnell has blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 2,600 plus days. Strom Thurmond refused to pass the Civil Rights Act of 57 for one day. We call him a racist. Well, what is McConnell? And we already know that when you allow voter suppression to happen, we don't have the Protection of Voting Rights Act, that allows people to get elected who then in fact pass policies that hurt the poor. Now going back, I just wanted to put that parenthesis in there, but going back to what you were saying, we're piecemealing this reality. And we're doing something with the Economic Policy Institute that's going to show what's going to happen if we do not have a full addressing of these issues. And we put out in the Poor People's Campaign the things that ought to be passed right now in the midst of COVID. We had 3 public health officials, one from Harvard, one from UCLA, one from Drexel, to come up with what is needed. And the bills fall short, but the bill that's in Congress now at least ought to be passed. But McConnell has said, unless you protect corporations from liability, the very corporation that didn't provide people their PPEs they need and put poor and low-wage workers at risk, and many of them have suffered and died. If you don't give me another F-35 plane, if you do not give me another $250 billion in tax cuts, I'm not passing this bill. So that's why every Monday we've been having something called Moral Monday March on McConnell's Mayhem, Madness, and Meanness. Every Monday. We've had over almost 1 million people to show up over the last 4 Mondays. Mark Ruffalo was on just yesterday with us, calling out McConnell. McConnell holding up a partial bill. And I want the members of the media to hear this. The bill that's there is not even fully what we need, but it's something. And McConnell will not even pass the something until he gets more for the corporations who have already made $755 billion as of early August during the pandemic. They are making money during the pandemic while people and their lives and their livelihoods are being destroyed and dying during the pandemic.
Okay, so what's that bill again that you would like to see passed again? What's the name of that one?
Heroes Bill.
Heroes Bill.
Heroes
Okay.
Bill. It was passed in the House and now it's sitting in the Senate. It's not everything, but it should be passed at its full rate. They've already now started talking about cutting another $1 trillion off of it. And Nancy Pelosi is saying she won't go below that. But the $3 trillion that they had in it is not enough. And the $3 trillion they had in it still was going to give some more money to corporations, and the corporations already have received trillions. That's really the story of this moment. If the media could tell that story when you talk about Trump, because he's trying to change the channel, wants to talk about false things, the infiltrators and the violence, and not but he wants to get that going. But if we could tell the real story, that what we ought to be afraid of and what's really hurting us is that he and McConnell have made sure that when people are dying and people can't go to work and people are the essential people that are holding up this economy, they only received about 17% of the money. 80% of the money went to corporations and banks, right? And even now they're blocking. That's the story, because that's killing people. It's not just bad policy, it's killing people.
Okay, so a kind of a related question to the congressional policy. People often look to the White House and Congress to appropriate money for programs. There's also a push to have the Federal Reserve step into the inequality debate and making addressing inequality part of its mandate. Do you have thoughts about whether that is necessary or would be effective?
Yes, we think every entity of government has to face this issue of policy and poverty and inequality. Because again, we're not talking about, even if we were just talking about 2% of the nation, we should address it from a moral perspective, the least of these, but we're talking about 50% of the country, right? We're talking about the economic health and future of the nation. If you think about it from a pyramid standpoint, I don't care what's happening at the top. If the foundation of the pyramid cracks and breaks apart, the top's coming down too. It doesn't matter that Wall Street is being upheld right now back through tax buybacks where the corporations have taken their tax cuts and purchase their own stocks to keep it high. That's a false measurement, right? That's a false measurement. So the Federal Reserve, the Congress, everybody, all the entities should come together and address in full, a full comprehensive dealing with the issue of poverty and low wealth. Problem is we got to get folks to say it first. As I said, Republicans racialize poverty, Democrats will say poverty, but normally they say people who are working to get into the middle class or the working people. It's like, why can't you say poverty? Why can't you say it? It's real. It's not wrong. So we need to have the words said, but we also need every part of government, because poverty, people who are poor and low wealth are impacted. So yes, the Federal Reserve, we need the banking, the Federal Reserve, we need the environmental parts of government, we need the labor parts of government. All of those entities have to come together and say, we are going to address this in this, the most wealthiest country in the nation. Okay.
So we have time for, I think, just one more question. If somebody else has a question out there and you want to raise your hand, we might be able to get it in. Then we're going to show your final video. And
let me say this.
Sure.
There's no way that the Federal Reserve and the federal and Mnuchin and them can with a straight up, well, maybe they can say we're going to infuse $1.5 trillion into corporations, particularly in the midst of COVID, where people are literally not working and dying, and not say we're going to use those same methodologies to infuse money. And the difference between infusing money in the poor and low wealth community than infusing it in the corporation is normally you fuse it up to the top, they're going to keep most of it to the top. But if you infuse it in the body, it's going to spread out to the whole economy and help lift the economy. That's what we pay people $15 an hour. You pump $368 billion into the economy because it's disposable. People use that income. And so it's a greater investment if you invest in the poor and low wealth communities than it is if you simply pump more money at the top that's already bloated.
Okay. I think this is going to be the final question. It's from a non-journalist, but it's a very good big picture question from Catherine Carroll. Dr. Barber, I'm a disabled woman in Albany, New York, and I'm an attorney, an organizer, and an active member of the New York State Poor People's Campaign since January. Would you please articulate for those people who don't necessarily identify as being poor or overtly marginalized or oppressed why we all are negatively affected by persistent inequality and systemic oppressive forces?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we say in the Poor People's Campaign, we say poor and low wealth, because oftentimes people don't identify as poor. So of course we are actually, what we're finding though is a lot of people they don't want to be identified as poor, and that means something wrong with them. But they don't have any problem with being identified as poor because the systems keep them poor. You know, somebody that's poor that's working, it's not they're not working. They're working in low-wage jobs. They're working in jobs without health care, without the things that they need. But again, what we know from this, as Joseph Stiglitz says in his book, The Price of Inequality, that in a society, when you have a consistent above 40, nearly 50% of the people living in poverty and low wealth, that will always keep your economic systems unstable. It's going to cost. We are actually hurting our economy. We're hurting ourselves. We're not being our best in terms of the development of this country, and it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary. And when you see it, Chris, is when COVID hit. See, people were kind of ignoring it, but now COVID has exposed the fissures of poverty. You think about where we would be right now if we, going into COVID, everybody had health care. Everybody had a living wages and had some money they could stay out of work for a minute. Everybody had sick leave and unemployment. All the things we're talking about passing now, even with the CARES Act and the health bill, those things should already be a part of our reality. So the reality, and so the poverty and low wealth are the matters of national security. And we refuse to address poverty and low wealth and these other four interlocking injustices at our nation's peril. We cannot survive like this. We cannot survive with an impoverished democracy, where your voting rights are threatened, where people are working every day and can't live and living in their cars, where if a child is born poor, it's more likely they're going to remain poor. Whereas Dr. King says we keep getting this check back marked insufficient funds, and yet we see all the funds riding around town, if you will, the metaphor, and we see the money, we know it's in the bloated military budgets, we see it at the top. You cannot continue to have domestic tranquility. You cannot continue to say you believe in the establishment of justice and the providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare. We cannot claim to be a deeply moral and exceptional nation when nearly 50% of the people are poor and low wealth. Our economic systems will always be shaky and up and down. And so we refuse to address this issue at our own peril as a society. We are not experiencing genuine democracy. If the poverty we have today is just as ugly as plantation capitalism that allowed slavery to exist for 250 years, and it didn't have to. We must break this. We must address these issues. And thanks to the sister who's a part of the Poor People's Campaign and who also identified as disabled, I do understand that. And here's the last thing, and I'll let you do. The answer is not in the politician. We are being called to be a movement. If poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality, and every ability, we actually now, the rejected of this society, have the power to build a political force that can change the focus of our public policy. And we are, and we will, and we must. We are not going anywhere. That's what the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And I will say on this call lastly, we didn't march on June the 20th in mass, that 3 million people came online. We're now gonna march to the polls because we got these numbers, and we know that we just 2 or 3% of poor, low wealth people in places can change the electorate, can change the Senate. The Senate, the makeup of the Senate is in the hands of poor and low wealth people right now. But next year, COVID gone, we intend in every race, creed, and color to bring our movement to the streets for the soul and the sake of America. We won't be silent anymore. We can't be silent. And we're bringing together a counterintuitive movement, which is what I want you to see now with this video. Chris, that's the serious reality. Now, I could have a video that would show you the people rising up, but I wanted deliberately to put that and leave it there just that sober, because the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. And some of us have said in this moment, when any of us could be dead in 48 hours, be on a ventilator because of COVID, some of us have made a pact to say, ask this question, what would we be doing if we knew we only had 48 hours of breath left? And so some of us have said, we're gonna make a pact that we're gonna live like we only have 48 hours left. And some of the people you saw there, and saying we're gonna fight every day. We're only gonna give our breath to things that address these 5 issues, whether we live 48 hours or 48 days or 48 minutes or 48 years. And I wanna really, as a clergy person, as a bishop in the church, as a pastor, plead with the media to make this a centerpiece issue, because those are the people, not about me. I grew up poor, I could tell you that, but it's the people all over this country. And they have the power to shift this nation. But so many times as I've traveled around this country, they feel like nobody will even call their name or call their situation. They see election and campaign season go in and go, come and go, and no one ever, even for just one debate, focuses extensively and exclusively on the issues facing, which will soon be more than 50% of the country. I am so thankful that you all are allowed to do this. It's a prayer. I'm about to cry because it's a prayer we've had in the movement. It's a prayer we've had in the movement that journalists would take seriously this issue, because I've been in too many places where if people were just received as human beings and we would talk about them and we've got everything we need to change this. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be this way. And the people are saying, those are the people that are saying it's not going to be this way. So my time is up. thank you so much. And let's tell the truth and set this nation free.